I'd like to welcome everybody to the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting number 74. Today where we're going to hear from the Canada Border Services Agency, Robert Mundy, Acting Vice President, Dan Prue, and the Department of Citizenship and Immigration with Michael Olson and Audrey White. But first of all, there is the motion to be made by Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be quick out of respect for the time of our witnesses. I talked briefly about this last time. Some committee members made some comment on it as well. But just to remind committee members, a motion I submitted Friday, October 20th, 2017, that pursuant to Standing Order 1083H6, which again, to reference people, the mandate of the committee, this is what 1083H6 says, in case those haven't committed it to memory yet. The mandate of the Standing Committee, in cooperation with other committees, to review of and report on any federal legislation, regulation, or standing order which impacts upon the access to information or privacy of Canadians or the ethical standards of public office holders. So that's what 1083H6 does. So that pursuant to Standing Order 1083H6, the committee undertake a study of the Conflict of Interest Act and how it relates to public office holders, that the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner be invited to discuss her 2013 recommendations, provided in the context of the 5-year review of the Act, that the Finance Minister be invited to explain decisions he made in accordance with the Conflict of Interest Act, and this study begin as soon as possible. So that's it.
Any debate?
Forgive us for the repetition.
Well, certainly we would support this motion and would call for a recorded vote.
Okay. Mr. Erskine-Smith.
So it's a little bit of deja vu because I made this comment last week as well, but I don't think anyone on this side has concerns with inviting the Ethics Commissioner. It's certainly within the purview of our mandate, and certainly to discuss her 2013 recommendations. If we can improve the law, we ought to improve the law. But we also don't want to turn this into question period and further politicize a particular individual. I don't think that's particularly fair or the right thing to do. And so I've got, I think, a friendly amendment to remove that the Finance Minister be invited to explain the decisions he has made in accordance with the Conflict of Interest Act, and that the study begin as soon as possible, and instead insert after a year review of the Act, and that this study begin in January or February 2018.
Mr. Cullen.
I totally understand the Liberal member's concerns about the Finance Minister piece there. It was pointed out by Mr. Kent, I think, prior, that under the rules of the different committees, when it's behavior of an individual around ethics, it actually may fall under the purview of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, PROC. So I can understand the government not wanting Mr. Morneau in front of us under these conditions. So while I think it would be more ideal to hear from Mr. Morneau, because I think he has a story to tell, the only quibbling I would have with is the delay on what we're doing. That I know, just based on our previous, was it in camera or not? Oh, we've talked about calendar prior. It was in camera. I suspect that there might be space in our calendar prior to Christmas. I don't know for certain, because, but I think from my recollection, and any public utterances from the committee's chair, I don't think I remember any moment in which our calendar was filled up right to the end docket of Christmas. So if there could be something, I don't suspect a full study would even be possible prior to Christmas, and that's not what I'm suggesting, but someone like the Ethics Commissioner coming in could certainly answer some questions we may have, but also help committee members with what a scope of study might be, and then prepare us well going into January, February, if we were to dive deep on this, if the committee chose that in one of those in-camera meetings, to look at the Ethics Act, Ethics and Conflict of Interest Act. That could be something, but just something where we got at least going now at that sort of initial scope, and then allow committee members to put something more fulsome forward as we went ahead.
Sure. So we have an amendment on the floor. Mr. Erskine-Smith?
I would just quickly say I don't think it makes sense to start something that we're going to then have a month and a half to then return to. I think it makes sense to start. We have things to do. The estimates, I think, are something we have to deal with before we rise as well. Frankly, rather than trying to jam this into 1 or 2 days that we might have at the very end, let's start fresh when we return in the new year and deal with this as seriously as we can, and deal with it all at once.
Mr. Cullen?
This sometimes happens, that I completely understand the perspective of the Liberal members on it. Can we, I'd vote in favor of the following, that we went ahead and voted on this, and then if Mr. Smith wanted to propose his amended piece, we would need unanimous consent, I think, to allow it to be introduced and voted upon today. New motion?
Can you say that again?
Would we require unanimous consent of the committee to allow a new motion that had different scope on it? Sorry? Yeah, but it has to be accepted as friendly.
What's being,
If we don't put a timeline on it, I mean, frankly, I don't think we are going to have space to start this until the new year anyway. So I'm happy just removing the last 2 provisions and just say, rather than start immediately, it's remove the finance minister, remove start immediately. I thought it made sense to start in January and say as much, so that it doesn't get delayed down the road even further. But if you prefer that we don't say anything, I think that's sufficient as well.
right now, we can vote on the amendment, that's fine. We can do that right now and have a recorded vote, et cetera.
Okay.
And then if the amendment passes, then we can vote on the main motion and proceed. So what would you like to do, Mr. Kent?
I wouldn't mind hearing from Mr. Kent as well.
Well, I'd like to, thank you, Chair, and I would like to see an eventual recorded vote on the motion as it stands, but I do agree and understand the logic, and the simple removal of that phrase after the semicolon to the end of the Conflict of Interest Act, we would support.
So just so I got you right, Peter, you would support it if at that very last section at the
That the
beginning?
Finance Minister be invited to explain decisions he's made in accordance with the Conflict of Interest Act.
You were suggesting strike that all?
I would strike that all.
Okay. I thought it was poetry the way it was written, but okay.
Just out of curiosity, so do my colleagues on the Conservative side have concerns with beginning this in January or February? I mean, is that a...
Well, with the law, it is one of the more pressing issues before the House at the moment. And not wanting to get into the slots that may or may not be available, I think that we would like it to be a priority. So I think that's the position. So
we're finishing an act. We're finishing 2 studies, and Pepita and the Border Security. I think that's a lot of work to do before the end of the year, and to commit to doing it upon returning. I mean, I don't think we're...
No, absolutely, it does make
this.
sense. I mean, we're here to work, but if it were possible, we would favor immediate. If it's not possible, I mean, studies are very often interrupted by significant periods of time, so the record stands until the report's written anyway.
So we have an amendment before us right now that we need to proceed on. So is there any further debate?
the conversation, and then we'll be able to...
So recorded vote has been asked for, so we'll have a recorded... Just hold on a second.
Do you mind if Mr. Smith read it one more time, Chair? Just
Sure, so that we would be deleting everything after in the context of the 5-year review of the Act, semicolon, so everything thereafter would be deleted, and instead we would say and that this study begin in January or February 2018.
We'll put it to a recorded vote. Now, this is the amendment, just to be clear.
Yes. On the amendment, yes or no for Mr. Bayliss? Yes. Monsieur Dubourg? Monsieur Erskine-Smith?
Yes.
Madame Fortier?
Oui.
Monsieur Picard?
Oui.
Mr. Saney?
Yes.
Monsieur Gourde? Mr. Kent?
Yes.
And Mr. Cullen?
Yes.
So,
Now we can proceed to the main motion.
As amended.
As amended. Recorded vote.
is there any debate?
Yeah. Is there any debate? We've already kind of debated this, but yes, is there any more debate? Okay. We'll move to the recorded vote as well then, because it's been asked for.
Donc, sur la motion telle
On the motion as amended, Mr. Bayliss.
Monsieur Dubourg? Monsieur Erskine-Smith.
Yes.
Madame Fortier.
Oui.
Monsieur Picard. Monsieur Saini.
Yes.
Monsieur Gourde.
Oui.
Monsieur Kent.
Yes.
Et Monsieur Cullen. Passes.
And that's it. So it does pass. So that will happen in January or February. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for witnesses as well. We'll start off with Canada Border Services Agency, starting off with 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Robert Mundy, and I'm the Acting Vice President of the Corporate Affairs Branch. I have with me today Dan Prue, who is Director of the Access to Information and Privacy Division at the Canada Border Services Agency. Cette division.
The ATIP division is responsible for overseeing the access and privacy functions at the agency. This includes administering and fulfilling all legislative requirements of the Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act related to processing requests. Interacting with the public, CBSA employees, other government institutions, and the offices of the Information Commissioner and Privacy Commissioner, and this regarding investigations and audits, and implementing measures to enhance our capacity to process requests.
Outline the CBSA's access and privacy functions, how the agency performs against established service standards, and highlight some of the successes and challenges we experience in our administration of the acts. As the second largest law enforcement agency in the federal government, the agency is responsible for border functions related to customs, immigration enforcement, and food, plant, and animal inspection. L'agence applique et exécute.
The agency administers and enforces two principal pieces of legislation. First of all, the Customs Act, which outlines our responsibilities to collect duties and taxes on imported goods, interdict illegal goods, and administer trade legislation and agreements. And secondly, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which governs both the admissibility of people into Canada and the identification, detention, and removal of those deemed to be inadmissible under the Act.
The agency also enforces 90 other statutes, many on behalf of numerous federal departments and agencies. Mr. Chair, given the numerous daily interactions the agency has with businesses and with individuals on a variety of matters, we are no strangers to requests for access or personal information. We have approximately 62 employees working in the ATIP division, 44 of whom are solely dedicated to the processing of privacy and access to information requests. The agency also has an internal network of 16 liaison officers who provide support to the ATIP division within the agency's branches at headquarters and in regions across the country. The CBSA's operating expenditures to run its privacy and access to information program totaled approximately $5.1 million in 2016-17, with $4.3 million dedicated to salary and $800,000 to non-salary expenditures. With respect to volumes of requests received under the Access to Information Act, we received just over 6,250 requests in 2016-17, which is the second highest total for a department within the Government of Canada. And under the Privacy Act, our numbers are equally significant. Actually, we have approximately 11,600 requests.
Furthermore, in the first half of this fiscal year, there has been a 15% increase in the number of requests received under both acts. These high volumes are largely attributable to individuals seeking copies of their history of arrival dates into Canada.
Year 2016-17, 78% of privacy requests and 45% of access requests came from individuals seeking their traveler history. That's a report that we generate, which is used to support residency requirements for programs administered by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada and by Employment and Social Development Canada. Analysts from the ATIP division have direct access to the database that houses these reports. Also, the review of these reports and the application of the law are standard, which allows our analysts to complete these requests without needing to obtain recommendations on disclosure from departmental officials. This greatly reduces the time it takes analysts to process these types of requests. Of all the requests completed last fiscal year, the CBSA was successful in responding within the legislated timeframe in more than 8 of 10 cases under both acts. As indicated in the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's annual report last year to Parliament, 70 complaints were filed against the CBSA to the Privacy Commissioner. And given the large volume of requests that we process, this number is a very small proportion of the total requests closed, representing less than 1%. A similar result was seen under the Access to Information Act. A total of 125 complaints were filed with the Information Commissioner, representing less than 2% of the requests completed by the CBSA. However, we do aspire to better serve Canadians and look to find ways of improving our service. Nos réussites illustrent l'engagement.
Our success reflects the CBSA's commitment to ensuring that every reasonable effort is made to meet obligations under both the Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act. The CBSA strives to provide Canadians with the information to which they have a right in a timely and helpful manner by balancing the right of access with the need to protect the integrity of border services that support national security and public safety.
Innovative approaches and careful planning will help the agency to continue the success into the future. In closing, we welcome the review of the Access to Information Act and Privacy Act, and will fully support and adopt any new measures that are introduced by the Treasury Board Secretariat following passage of legislative reforms. I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity for us to provide our input into your study and for welcoming us here today, and I look forward to the members' questions.
Thank you. Next up, Department of Citizenship and Immigration for 10 minutes.
Chair, my name is Michael Dolson. I'm the Director General of Corporate Affairs and Chief Privacy Officer at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. Accompanying me today is Audrey White. She's the Director of Access to Information and Privacy at IRCC. I thank you for welcoming us here today and to give us an opportunity to discuss the Bill C-58, an act to amend the Access to Information and Privacy Acts. IRCC has had the opportunity to appear before this committee 2 previous occasions to discuss this review. Mr. Chair, I want to discuss our department's performance first and then move into a discussion about the proposed amendments to the Act. In
2012-2013, the department received 30,124 ATIP requests. Since that time, the number of requests has more than doubled. Over the course of 2016-2017, we received more than 63,000 ATIP requests, which represents a 23% increase from the previous year. For the current year, we are again seeing a 23% increase in the number of requests received. In 2016-2017, our last year of reporting, IRCC received more access to information requests than any other federal institution. IRCC represents approximately half of all ATIP requests received by the Government of Canada.
Despite this increase in volume, IRCC was able to maintain a compliance rate of 79% for access to information requests, 68% for privacy requests. The ETIP division has been efficient in managing the volume of requests received in order to meet the legislative deadline. IRCC has launched a number of initiatives in an effort to improve its performance and to address current challenges. Although these initiatives have increased productivity year over year, we continue to create strategies aimed at decreasing our backlog and improving our compliance rate. The majority of ATIP requests received and processed within our department concern immigration case files. The department holds personal information on millions of individuals and collects significant amounts of personal information annually due to applications for citizenship, passports, permanent and temporary residence. This, in turn, has a direct effect on the growing number of ATIP requests received by IRCC. Mr. Chair, a total of 165 official complaints against IRCC were filed to the Information and Privacy Commissioners last year, representing less than 1% of all requests processed during that period. The duty to assist is taken seriously at IRCC, and the ATIP division notifies requesters of possible delays in service. We act proactively to minimize the number of complaints. ATIP also offers diverse training, in person and online, to IRCC employees on the importance of safeguarding privacy and protecting personal information. Mr. Chair, as the Chief Privacy Officer at IRCC, I'm pleased to announce that we'll be having our second annual Privacy Day on November 1st. This will provide a forum to spotlight key privacy issues in a complex and rapidly changing technological environment. Most importantly, Privacy Day demonstrates our continuous efforts to develop a culture of privacy institution-wide, as well as our commitment to increase privacy vigilance. At IRCC, protecting privacy and personal information is paramount. Mr. Chair, Bill C-58 provides a new subsection under Section 6.11 that provides government institutions the ability to refuse requests that are vexatious or in bad faith or missing key details. This new power is discretionary, and IRCC will continue to exercise judgment appropriate to the spirit of the legislation. As I mentioned, IRCC is committed to the duty to assist principles embedded in the Act. We already process requests that lack specific details, either because they are unknown, unnecessary, or unspecified. Where necessary, ATIP works with requesters to clarify the scope of the request and to obtain missing information. We would only consider refusal in exceptional circumstances where, for example, all duty to assist options have been exhausted, processing the request would be impossible, or processing the request would impose a significant burden on IRCC that could not be reasonably managed through extensions, time extensions, or other provisions of the Act. Mr. Chair, I thank you again for the invitation to provide IRCC's view on this important subject and for welcoming us here today. And I look forward to any questions you or the committee have. Thank you.
Thank you. Very timely, too. You only used up about 5 minutes, so there's a lot more time for questions. First up, MP Erskine-Smith. 7 minutes.
Thanks very much for all this information. Mr. Olson, maybe start with you just to get a comparison. We heard some numbers from the CBSA in relation to their budget and the number of individuals that are focused on ATIP, and perhaps you could provide us with the same information.
Yep, our staff complement varies over the year. We have casual employees, we have full-time employees. Roughly, there are about 80 full-time equivalent employees in ATIP at IRCC. Our budget is around about $5 million.
Interesting. Okay, and when we talk about compliance rates, in both of your testimonies, you indicated fairly high compliance rates. Maybe, is that in reference to the 30 days prescribed limit in the Act, or that's also in reference to asking for an extension and meeting the time limit within the extension?
If the extension is asked for and granted, then that would count as the time limit.
Okay, so 79% of the time it's not within the 30 days. It's that 21% of the time you're actually beyond what you've even asked for in terms of an extension from the Information Commissioner.
The extensions are granted in cases they have to be justified. So if we go beyond 30 days, that 30 days does have to be justified.
No, I understand that, but it's 21% of the time you're beyond what you were able to justify, I guess. And resources appears to be one question to me, or one answer to me. More resources. When it comes to the Act itself, can you point me to provisions of the Act that would help limit your burden or help you deal with the increasing number of, the doubling in the last 5 years or so?
The doubling really has been due to the fact that, obviously privacy is a growing concern of everyone. I think everyone realizes that 10 years ago was not the concern in the public that it is now. People are interested in knowing what information government has on them. As I say, we have a lot of information on a lot of people, and they know the Access to Information Act. They know how to use it, so they make requests of us.
But so maybe I'll be more specific. So Section 6 of the Act, we've heard some testimony that suggests it is drafted in such a way that it will be too exclusionary and will be too complicated for the layperson to ask for information. Presumably it was drafted for a reason, and you guys are sitting in the department and may have an explanation for why you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. When you look at Section 6, is Section 6 helpful? Beyond vexatious, and I don't want to get there because I think everyone agrees the Information Commissioner agrees that that's fine, but are there other provisions in Section 6 that are helpful?
To my mind, again, Section 6 is probably not going to, if you will, hurt the volume growth. That is, it won't affect the volume growth. A lot of the ATIP requests that we receive are related to case files. So people want to know about immigration case files. So they've made an application for permanent residence or temporary residence. They want to know what we've got.
So I'll put the same question to folks at the CBSA. Do you view provisions in the Act, I'll use Section 6 as an example, perhaps there are others, that will help reduce the current burden?
Okay. Dan Prue for CBSA. In our opinion, yes, it will help reduce the burden. Having folks file requests by subject matter will stop what we commonly refer to in the ATIP community as fishing expeditions, whereby folks will ask for anything and everything without a subject, sometimes without parameters around that request. So if you complement a duty to assist with the efforts of government for open government initiatives, and then you include Section 6 as it's currently proposed, I see it working quite well. If more information is public, folks will know what type of information to request. Requests will be specific. There'll be parameters about what they can request and how much of it they can request, which will stop, like as I mentioned, those types of requests that will simply say, give me anything and everything you have about not even a subject, but between two individuals for the last 6 months, which could include the most common type, which would be email accounts, whereby someone would ask for your entire email Outlook account because they don't know what you're working on. So they, instead of asking for a subject, they're going to say, just give me the whole box.
All right. Well, CBSA, you provided us 45% of your ATIP requests are traveler history. I wonder, to IRCC, do you have similar numbers in terms of common requests?
Yep, roughly, I think it's about 96% of our requests are related to case information.
Of an individual asking for information about their own case?
Correct.
And it seems that that's not really what ATIP was originally designed for, perhaps. Is there no way to make this information available to individuals to log into an account and find this information out themselves without going through a cumbersome ATIP process?
We are working on a way to get that information to people much more easily, but it's not necessarily as easy as it might appear at first blush.
I would encourage you to speak to folks at the CRA who seem to have figured it out. You know what? I think that's actually the only other question I would have, because it's not specific to the legislation, but specific to ATIP requests, is the software that different departments use. Do you speak to ATIP folks at other departments, and are you all using the same software, or are you on different software?
We are on the Access Pro case management. Most departments are, as I understand. And we use it. It is getting near to the end of its useful life, and I know that Treasury Board Secretariat is actively looking at replacing it, and we look forward to the replacement.
And CBSA?
We use the same system. It's commonly used in federal government because there's limitations out there as to who can produce an ATIP tracking system.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Pierre Smith. Next up, MP Kent for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all of you for appearing before us today. First, a general question to the agency and to the department. The Information Commissioner has quite roundly considered Bill C-58 to be a regression of existing rights, and I would just like to get the opinion of you, Mr. Mundy, and you, Mr. Olson, of how you would characterize Bill C-58 in the Information Commissioner's terms.
Thank you for the question. I would say that the Access to Information Act has not been looked at since 1983, so this is a long time in coming, but it seems to me that it's a step-by-step process of reform. I think the discussion we've just had here around Section 6 as an indication of something that would help the community to have more precision around the types of requests that we get. So I see that as a positive, not a negative. And along the lines of what Mr. Olson said, it's really the way that we would use that section of the Act should it exist. And we're going to use it in a very deliberative fashion with direction from Treasury Board Secretariat, so that we're actually fulfilling that duty to assist, but still insisting that we provide, that we get from the requester a greater detail on what they're looking for. So from that perspective, I think it is positive.
Mr. Olson?
I agree. I think certainly from the perspective of the public, the changes are positive. Sections 74, actually the sections that require disclosure, proactive disclosure of briefing books, for example, of ministers and also of deputy heads, I think that's very positive for the public. There are things I think that also help, and I think they help the expenditure of public funds. And if I can put it this way, I know the Information Commissioner said that she didn't want any limit placed in Section 6.1, limit placed on, how many records, if records were too voluminous.
Yes.
As an example,
next question, actually.
Yeah, but as an example, we are dealing with a request right now where the number of records could get into the tens of millions, So let's just say there were 30 million. If you're processing one page a minute, all day, every day, it will take, you could do probably 120,000 pages a year. What that means is it would take roughly 300 person years to actually process that one request, all those records. So imagine all the members of the House of Commons working on one file for an entire year, nothing else, working on one file. And for the person who suggested that file having paid $5 to make that request. I do not believe that that is a prudent use of taxpayer dollars. So I think that there should be some limit on that. You should be able to limit the requests that we answer in some ways, and I think what's in the Act is in fact quite reasonable.
And the recommendation that all fees be removed would obviously be...
The interim directive from Treasury Board Secretary was that the vast majority of fees are being reduced. The $5 filing fee is still there, and that remains unchanged. I can't really make a recommendation on that.
Thank you. Last week, we had an appearance by Mr. Terrien, the Privacy Commissioner, and one of his key points was that he sees Bill C-58 as a disruption to the balance between his office, himself as Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner. You've spoken to the balance that you try to achieve within your the agency and the department. I'm just wondering, do you believe that there is potential for disruption of an existing balance in either of your situations?
There are elements where in the Act where the Information Commissioner is allowed to exercise order power, and in those cases where the information would involve personal information, the Privacy Commissioner, to my mind, must be notified of that, certainly. Otherwise, I'm not sure that I see a lot of problems in the current.
So you would agree in that case with his presentation, his position that C-58 confers order-making powers improperly or in an unwise way, in a way that would disrupt your balance?
As I say, as long as the Privacy Commissioner were consulted on the release of that information, I wouldn't necessarily see a problem. There might be a cleaner way of doing that, but I'm not sure I see a huge problem.
Mr. Mundy?
Yeah, if I could just raise a different point. It's important to realize that for almost every government department agency, it's the same people that are working on both the records for access to information as well as for privacy. So one of the only issues that I would have is if the Information Commissioner orders a department to proceed with a given request, that could have an impact on our ability to address other requests in a timely fashion, which could be both on the access to information and the privacy side. So it's always a trade-off between the volumes on each side and how you try your best to address the time constraints on both sides, but it would depend on the degree to which that order issuing power was exercised.
And briefly, there's been a great deal of discussion over frivolous and vexatious and good faith. I wonder if, rather than going into a long prologue, I wonder if you could address your perceptions of frivolous, vexatious, and in good faith, as referenced in C-58. Is frivolous and vexatious an issue for you today?
For the most part, I would hesitate to use the word frivolous. I think that's wrong. Vexatious might be a little bit closer. But I certainly agree with my colleague's view that sometimes, perhaps increasingly, there are fishing expeditions. And people look for, they make a request for email subject headers. So they're not actually requesting information. They want to know what's on the menu before they decide what to order. And in this context, I'm not sure that that's what the Act was originally intended for. Certainly the Act goes back to 1983. There was no email at that point, so such things could not be. So I don't think that's what was intended. And I think to the extent that we can avoid requests like that, they take up a lot of time of the people who are being ATIP, but also the people processing the ATIP requests. And it would be nice to be able to, in some ways, as I say, limit those.
It's time. Next up, MP Cullen, 7 minutes.
Sure, thank you to our witnesses. Let's pick up on that last stream there, Mr. Olson. Would you deem somebody doing that, what you call the fishing, looking up for subject headers, would that be seen as, just in your own purview and having watched the Act perform, frivolous or vexatious?
Could be. It could
but
be.
Isn't that sometimes the nature, though, of trying to get access to information from government? One of the concerns that's been raised by journalist groups, advocacy groups, First Nations organizations is sometimes if you knew exactly the document you were looking for, that's rarely the case for Canadians trying to get at some information that they are due. If I'm just looking back at some of the access to information requests that have revealed important public policy decisions, Afghan detainee transfers, the F-35 purchases, those types of things, the person requesting the information didn't know specifically what document they were looking for, had to do that net first before they could start to focus in. Is not the duty to consult or duty to assist where that starts to come into play, where if somebody's gone so broad, you say, well, what is it exactly that you're after? And then you start to refine the search that way. I think there's a false. Let me let you answer that question first before I go to the next.
When we get requests for email subject headers of 100, 150 varied employees for a period of 3 or 4 months, and there's no real strategy to this request. These requests, if I can put it that way, there's no specific information or even subject that is being looked at.
But is that not where the duty to assist kicks in, where you're able to communicate with the requester and say, you've done a very broad ask, is there something we can help you with in terms of focusing your efforts? Doesn't work that way?
If someone wants to know something about permanent residence, the permanent residence program, sure, we would be happy to help. And we have not turned down such requests in the past.
I'm just wondering, what percentage, and this is going to be anecdotal, but how much of these requests would you deem as vexatious? Like, there's this notion out there that there's people just trying to muck up the wheels of government or something, or trying to cause pain. But we've heard from advocates of the access to information that it's quite a rare circumstance, because maybe there are Canadians out there that just like to cause trouble and want to use ATIP and they're bored. But I think the vast majority that we hear from are doing this in some effort to pry government information from government.
There's a handful per year.
Right. Are they repeat offenders, if we could use that term? There are specific people that just keep going at CBSA and the various agencies?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. There's a handful per year.
Because you can understand the concerns about who gets to interpret these very broad terms.
Of course.
If somebody has a piece of information they suspect will be damaging to their department or to their minister, there may be a temptation that we're concerned about in future of saying, well, I deem that frivolous. I deem that vexatious. Vexation is in the eye of the beholder, as we all know in life. So could it be true in the application of this Act? Is that I'm looking at you both.
We would rely on guidance from Treasury Board Secretariat in that regard. We're not about to.
Yeah. I'm not sure that's the best arbitrator, though, if you follow me. If they may be concerned about the same embarrassing documents being slipped out. There's been the ministers were before us They tried to make an equivalency between proactive disclosure and access to information as if they were equivalent. I'd offer those are false equivalents. The notion of government offering up more information by default, who's going to argue against that? But the things where we seek to correct government behavior or curb waste or any of those things that happen in government, it's a very large institution with a very large budget, the idea that they're equivalent seems like a false equivalency in my mind. Mr. Mundy, you seem to think C-58 was okay. I just went through the commissioner's report, and I added up as she went through piece by piece. She had 13 categories where she saw this bill as regressive, 3 of them neutral, 2 of them positive, and 2 of them outstanding. Is she wrong? You seem to pass this seems okay. She's going at this from the perspective of the public seeking information. 13 negative, 3 neutral, 2 positive, 2 outstanding.
Right.
Is she wrong?
Really, I don't have an opinion on whether she's right or she's wrong. I'm looking at it in terms of our responsibilities under the Act and our ability to actually fulfill our responsibilities under that Act. So that's the perspective that I take.
So that perspective is from someone who has to fulfill these access to information requests.
Very much so.
I think has to do the work of looking at it from 2 perspectives, one from the public seeking the information and one from the government trying to fulfill the information.
For sure.
I'm just, it's just we're getting, other than the ministers, I think you're the first panel we've had that I've seen. Maybe there have been others I missed that like this bill. There's very few who use access to information, seek information from government that like this legislation at all. Maybe they can find a few nuggets that are worthwhile. With my little of my time left, trying to take particulars. I can only work in specifics. You're dealing with migrants coming across the border. Right now we're setting up winterized trailers or something for them. If there were anything that you were doing and you offered that as advice to minister, would it shield it from C-58? If you said the cost estimate we think is going to be $100 million to set up a bunch of trailers. If you provide that as advice to administer under the current legislation, is that shielded from a future ATIP request?
The proposal to undertake certain
Yeah, so I'm
kinds
in your
of
department.
expenditures?
I'm looking at contracts to set up winterized trailers.
Well, contracts are public information, so that's proactively disclosed
I'm
every
dealing back
quarter.
and forth with the minister's office as to option A, B, and C. As soon as I provide that as advice to minister, what happens to that information, that
Well,
correspondence?
part of it may be advice, and I don't, Dan, if you want to speak to Section 21. So part of it could be advice, and then the government takes a decision, or the minister or the department takes a decision. So the decision that's taken is part of the public record, but it may be the advice that was provided by officials had various options, and that may not be made public under the Section 21 provisions.
Dan, sorry, Mr. Poole.
Most of the exemptions in legislation are discretionary. So to answer your question, we go through the exercise of discretion. We have a look at what's being requested, when it's being requested. You know, has the plan been implemented, or are they just putting numbers back and forth? Is it a final decision? And then you make a decision based on your exercise of discretion at the time the request is submitted. And timing is everything. I mean, you can request something today and be denied, request it next week, be given full access. So it also depends at moment in time the ITIP request comes into the institution.
So that would be helpful. I hope we get to explore that difference about timing.
Yes, timing is everything with an ATIP request.
I'd like to know more about that.
That's time.
Thank you, Chair.
Speaking of time.
Speaking of time.
Next up for 7 minutes, MP Saini.
Thank you very much for being here. I think there's been a lot of discussion about duty to assist, so I would like maybe just some clarity from you is in terms of what it actually means for those people who are trying to seek information under Bill C-58, and also just for procedural purposes, because I personally have never filled out an access to information request. So if you could maybe both departments could take me through step by step what the procedure is, how you receive the request, how you evaluate the request, and where you intercede to provide a duty to assist, just so I get an understanding of how the whole process works from beginning to end.
Questions for Dan Prue to answer as director of ATIP.
Okay. So generally speaking, how it works is that we get receipt of a request. They come in at night now with the online portals. Once we get a request, how it works is that the front-end staff for most ATIP shops, you have an administrative staff. They will log the request into the ATIP tracking system. That's a software you talked about earlier. The request is logged into the system, and then it moves over to a pod, if you will. And all the new requests that came in the day before, the night before, are sitting in this pod. There are a couple of hundred of them at any given day in our institution. Then what happens is that management assigns them to the analysts. So they're firmed out to, for example, we said we have about 40-odd analysts that respond to these. They go to them. First thing you would do when you get one of these new requests is you read it and make sure that you yourself understand it. Okay, if you do not understand the request, we go back and seek clarification right away. We will not task it out within the CBSA to do a record retrieval if we don't understand it ourselves. When you look at the subject of a request, one of the first things that we do is we do a query in our system to see if someone else has requested something similar. Because as you know, we put subject lines of completed requests on the internet. So if I've processed a similar request in the past, I can offer that up. One, as a request that can satisfy your immediate needs, or maybe something that can help you out in the near term as I process your new request for similar information. So that is also done, because if we can satisfy you without having to process the whole request by giving you something we've given someone else, we save everyone time, and you're happy, we're happy, everyone's happy. Once we understand the request properly, you have this initial 30-day window to make a lot of decisions. In that 30-day window, I have to guess, without even having the records often, what's going to be coming my way. Am I going to need third-party consultations? I'm going to have to consult other government institutions. What am my indication of the volume that I'm going to receive? A lot of that is done by phone with the program area that has the records, the physical records. So you try and guesstimate what's coming through the pipe, because if you don't take your time extension within the first 30 days, you can't take it. That's your window. If you're lucky enough to get the information within the first 30 days, at CBSA, they come by way of a drop zone. So to expedite the processing, we created an online drop zone, so the records are electronically put into a portal and they're grabbed by my staff. CBSA is fully automated. We don't have paper. If we receive paper, we scan it, then we shred the paper. So everything moves in a system. Once we get the information back to us, to make sure that we have good, solid recommendations, that we have what's being requested, not more, not less, and that we have a thorough review of what's coming my way before I do an ATIP analysis, we have a mandatory process whereby an executive at the CBSA, an executive level, director above, needs to sign off that what is being requested is included in ATIP, it's complete, it's accurate, it's not too much, it's not too little, and here are the sensitivity recommendations or the recommendation to do a full disclosure. Those files are then assigned to an ATIP panelist. The volumes that we talked about right now, to give you an idea, when a lot of folks say, can you process this in 30 days? Currently at ATIP, CBSA, my folks have between 80 to 100 files each. Every single day when they come in the morning, they have about 80 to 100 to juggle, with an expectation to either get it out the door in 30 days or make that determination in 30 days whether an extension is needed and how long do you need. You can see it's very, very heavy workload, and everything is done very quickly in time in my office. Okay, when you get that all back to finish the process, you have to do a line-by-line review. Seriously, line-by-line review. And most of the exemptions, like I talked about, are discretionary. So you have to ask yourself, is this something that I can release to the public? Is it something that I need to exempt? If I exempt it and it's a discretionary exemption, how do I exercise my discretion? How do I document it? Why am I choosing to release or not release? Because we'll document the exercise of discretion both ways. Even if we do a disclosure, we'll document why we're doing the disclosure. If we don't, we'll document why. Once this is all done, it has to go to a delegated person. The Minister of Public Safety has delegated certain individuals to sign off on ATIP requests. The lowest delegation at CBSA is a team leader, which most of them are signed by them. They will do a cursory review of the line-by-line review that is done by the analysis to make sure that everything was done properly and everything's sustainable in law. Then they sign off. At CBSA to close, all true access requests, those are non-personal access requests, come to me by the delegated team leader for a quick review to make sure that everything was done properly. Then I give them the go-ahead and it's disclosed.
Just that.
Just that. And on any given
I'm
day, we
exhausted
have about
already.
3,000 on the floor.
Do you have any time left, or minute and a half? So, obviously, you try to appreciate that. We want to make life a bit easier, so we want to create proactive disclosure in general. I'm thinking of the Pareto principle, where you have the 80-20 rule. Over the course of time, when you have a decent sample size, and I think you mentioned you had 11,600 on the privacy side and 6,250 on the information side. Sure. So obviously 18,000, 19,000 requests per year ongoing. Is there any, you must find after a certain amount of time that you have very similar requests that are coming in. So proactively disclosing that information, would it free up more of your resources to deal with those people whose requests are very specific and very direct and directly targeted?
Yeah. In Robert's Monday's opening remarks, he talked about the traveler history report. That is a report that is highly utilized by IRCC, our colleagues here, to help them do a determination for citizenship applications. And what happens is that people come to CBSA ATIP to request a copy of the traveler history report about 12,000 times a year. That costs me about 10 FTEs or 800,000 out of my salary to respond to. And those traveler history reports are given to these ATIP requesters who are also citizen applicants that they submit as proof of how long they've been in the country, if you will. It's that is the highest volume of common requests that we have. We have worked with our colleagues at IRCC.
Just to understand,
We're at time.
Okay.
So if you can close it off in about 5-10 seconds.
No, that's okay.
Good? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next. We'll probably get 2 more questions in before time is up. MP Gord for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Out of the 12,000 requests that seem to be recurrent in your department, are these very similar requests? Because people want to know the date at which they entered Canada, but is there not a document we could send to them and they can keep, or do they have to all the time come back and ask it every time? This is not a document you can receive just very easily, because it will give you every single place you arrived, the hour at which you arrived. It will tell you how many times you came to Canada. This is therefore a document, and perhaps I can turn to my colleagues for their needs. It allows people to know how long they've been in the country. And so seeing as though we're at the port of entry, we're the ones who keep this information. It goes into our database, and then the report is generated. To help people gain access to this, we work very closely with IRCC. They have access to our information that produces the report. And since we gave them access in 2012, I think that they used about 500,000 different reports, which means that I had 500,000 fewer reports to do. There's still a 12,000 person residue that remains. To make access easier, we remove all sensitive information that would require a second set of eyes, because all they want is the date at which they entered Canada. That allows us to fully process the request. People have direct access to the system, and we can send them all the information they need. We have to use 10 members of staff just to work on these. What we're trying to do is create a system whereby people can go to a window, for example, in a public place, where you can input your personal data, and it will give you a renewal of your information. We would like to have a similar system than my account with the CRA, where people will be able to find their own information on their own. And if we can do that, that could be a benefit to us. It would reduce the number of ATIP requests, especially with regards to this bill. Information would be accessible in a different way, and so it would not be subject to the Access to Information Act. People would therefore have much quicker access to information. To at least guarantee private access, there is an issue of privacy, because some people could obtain information on others using such a system. In Bill C-58, are there any provisions that you have seen that could hinder your two departments and their operations?
Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui veut?
Perhaps someone else would like to take the floor. Could you repeat the question? In Bill C-58, are there any provisions in the bill that could hinder the work of your department? Currently, as the bill is written, we do not see any negative effects that could come from it. We completely support C-58. I think that this is a step in the right direction. This Act has to be modernized. We request a periodic review. It won't be perfect immediately, but it's a step in the right direction. If you had one recommendation to add to this bill, what would it be? If you had the opportunity to improve one thing about the bill, what would your suggestion be? It would be to implement it as quickly as possible. That is all.
Vigord. Next up, MP Dubourg, 5 minutes.
Yeah. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. We were laughing, or at least saying it was good to hear Mr. Proulx saying that this bill has to be implemented as rapidly as possible, and that at the same time you will continue to work, as you stated, on proactive disclosure, seeing how you will be able to make this information proactively available in order to reduce the number of requests. With regards to immigration, does Mr. Olsen have the same kind of situation? Do you also work in the field? Because you say that you receive about half of all requests made of the government. Could you describe to us, with regards to customs, what kind of requests do you receive? What are people asking of IRCC? There are 63,000 requests, so we've heard. So what exactly are these requests, generally speaking?
I'll ask Audrey to go into more detail, but again, the vast majority of those are case information. So people have made applications for permanent residence or temporary residence, and they want to know the status of their applications. They want to know why their applications were successful or not successful. Audrey, if you want to add anything more.
En termes de processus.
With regards to the process, as Mr. Proulx described, the process resembles their process resembles ours. It's a detailed process going through various channels so that we can process all requests as quickly as possible. We have a very daunting level of requests. 96% of requests we receive have to do with people who want to understand and have more information on their current status or case file. This is personal information. If I may, I think when Ms. Beck was here for the last time, she mentioned that the future of access to information is going to involve, based on new technologies to help us in managing the ever-increasing number of requests. This bill will help, yes, but improving our technology will also improve the situation. Yes, that is what we wish, but at the same time, we 338 MPs are here to serve Canadians. In my riding, if I have a constituent who would like to know where his or her immigration file is, this person contacts my office and we have direct contacts to tell this person certain information. Do you believe that these people don't use that stream enough? Because at the moment they seem to be turning towards ATIPs rather than turning towards their federal MP.
To my mind, the optimal solution is actually for IRCC, as my colleague from CBSA mentioned, is to get the information in the hands of the people whose information it is. they own that information.
Right.
There may be some things that cannot be
Okay.
revealed for national security reasons,
Okay.
but it is their information, and my desire is to be able to get as much information in people's hands. It's like knowing the status of your bank account. You can go in and check the status of your bank account and know what's in there. You shouldn't have to pay for
To
it.
pay for it, exactly. Et une question aussi à savoir.
A question. Are these requests made by the people themselves or by representatives or lawyers or notaries on behalf of these people?
There's a mix of requesters. We get all kinds. Of course, we get requests from foreign nationals as well. Those are done through a representative. And Audrey, happy for you to jump in.
Je dirais qu'en général,
Generally speaking, about 53-55% of requests are made by representatives, although it varies. I asked that question because today in the media we've heard of falsified passports. Have people made access to information requests and used the information to create fake passports?
I am not aware of any link.
Non. OK. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, witnesses, for testifying today before our committee. We're going to suspend briefly until our witnesses can take their seat, but thank you once again. Bring the meeting back to order. Just want to thank witnesses from Canadian Superior Court Judges Association, Pierre Bienvenu, and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Robert Ramsey. First up, 10 minutes. Pierre. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, membres du comité, thank you for inviting the Canadian Superior Court Judges Association to give its views on Bill C-58. My name is Pierre Bienvenu. I'm a lawyer in private practice at Norton Rose Fulbright, and I have long represented the association in relation to judicial compensation and benefits and other constitutional law issues. The association is composed of judges appointed by the federal government to the various levels of courts around the country. It has around 1,000 members, representing approximately 95% of all federally appointed judges, including judges of the superior courts, appellate courts, the tax court, and the federal courts. Members of the committee, the provisions of Bill C-58 that cover judges are of grave concern to the association. The judiciary was not consulted prior to the bill being tabled in Parliament, and the association therefore welcomes the opportunity to address this committee on questions that it considers fundamental. I should mention that the association has shared the submission I am presenting to you today with the Canadian Judicial Council, and the Council has indicated that it endorses this submission. Let me say at the outset that the judiciary acknowledges that Bill C-58 is pursuing important objectives of transparency and accountability. However, there are compelling reasons why these objectives, in the case of judges, must be pursued by means that differ from the means adopted for elected officials and members of the bureaucracy. The part of the bill relating to judges would require the publication of individualized information regarding judges' expenses, including the judge's name, a description of the expense, the date on which the expense was incurred, and the total amount of the expense. The expenses in question are those reimbursable under the Judges Act as so-called allowances. There are provisions in the bill proposing to allow the Registrar of the Supreme Court of Canada and the Commissioner for Judicial Affairs to withhold publication if publication could interfere with judicial independence or could compromise security or contains information that is subject to privilege or professional secrecy. There are three basic points I want to make here today. The first is that Bill C-58 proposes to apply to judicial expenses a regime that, insofar as accountability is concerned, is duplicative of control mechanisms that already exist in relation to reimbursable judicial expenses. The second is that the proposed expense publication regime is unsuitable for judicial expenses and raises profound concerns for all judges, but particularly for judges on national courts who are required to travel extensively. My third point is that the important objectives of the bill can be achieved by other means that do not violate judicial independence. These points are developed in a written submission of which I've provided a copy to the clerk of the committee and which I invite members of the committee to read. I have only time to say a few words on each of them. Bill C-58 is duplicative in relation to federally appointed judges because there are robust measures already in place to ensure that judicial expenses are legitimate, reasonable, and subject to independent verification. The categories of expenses that judges may incur in performing their functions are set out in the Judges Act. Judges cannot seek reimbursement of any expense falling outside of these defined categories. In addition, there is a federal official assisted by his own staff whose responsibility is to review each and every judicial expense claim to determine whether the submitted expense falls within the category set out in the Judges Act and whether it was properly incurred and is reasonable. That person is the Commissioner of Federal Judicial Affairs, and for the judges of the Supreme Court of Canada, it is the Registrar of the Supreme Court. I come to my second point. There are two fundamental problems with the proposed regime as it would apply to judges. The first is the granularity of the information required to be published, tying named individual judges to identifiable judicial expenses. The second is the designation of a member of the executive to make a final decision as to whether the publication required by the bill could interfere with judicial independence. Now, allow me to articulate the first concern by reference to expenses incurred by judges of Canada's national courts, such as the Federal Court of Appeal, and the Tax Court of Canada. National courts are a service to Canadians and an expression of our commitment to our country. Judges of these courts are required to reside in the National Capital Region, but they must travel extensively as they sit on cases across the country. As a result, they have significantly higher expenses than their colleagues at courts that do not require such extensive travel. Even among judges of national courts, some will travel more than others as a consequence of assignment decisions by their respective chief justices. The point is this: the total expenses of a judge may stand out for the reasons just given, but those expenses would have been incurred not by choice, but by reason of service on a national court and the assignment decisions of a judge's chief justice. It is grossly unfair, and indeed it is unacceptable, that the burden of standing out from the lot by reason of high traveling expenses be borne by an individual named judge as opposed to the court to which he or she belongs. Please also consider that by definition, the judicial function results in at least one party being dissatisfied with the result. The potential for mischief in the use of publicly available individualized expense information is enormous. And unlike persons working in other branches of government, judges may not defend themselves publicly when they stand attacked. There are also real concerns about the security of individual judges if it were publicly disclosed where they stay and eat while traveling on judicial duties, or where they gather for legal education conferences. There is a glaring constitutional defect in the safeguard clause at section 90.22 of the bill. That section, coupled with section 90.24, proposes to give the commissioner and the registrar final say on the question of whether the principle of judicial independence could be undermined by publication. The registrar and the commissioner are members of the executive branch. It is not acceptable from a constitutional perspective to give them the responsibility to make a final determination of such a question. I have presented the problems. I now turn to solutions, and it will be my third and final point. There are ways of balancing the bill's important objectives against the constitutional requirements of judicial independence. The commissioner could publish expense information according to the categories of reimbursable allowances set out in the Judges Act and according to each court. For example, disclose that judges of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice spent X dollars as a whole on legal education conferences during the period, while judges of the Federal Court spent X dollars as a whole on travel. It will be easy for the public, based on that information, to derive figures on a per judge, per court, and per expense category basis, which will attain the bill's transparency objective, all the while preserving judicial independence and not compromising the security of individual judges. As regards the safeguard clause, the decision of whether judicial independence could be undermined by publication could be made to reside with the Chief Justice of the court concerned. I thank you for your attention and remain available to answer your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll move on now to Canadian Union of Public Employees for 10 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Ramsey. I work as a Senior Research Officer with the Canadian Union of Public Employees at our national office here in Ottawa. I want to start by thanking the committee for this opportunity to present our thoughts on C-58. We look forward to seeing our recommendations as well as the serious concerns expressed by the witnesses in previous sessions reflected in your committee work. The Canadian Union of Public Employees, or CUPE, is the largest labour union in Canada. We represent 650,000 workers across the country in sectors as diverse as healthcare, social services, childcare, municipalities, schools, universities, and transportation, among others. Our members provide a range of vital public services in thousands of communities where they and their locals are engaged civic partners. Since our founding in 1963, CUPE has been one of the strongest and most consistent voices defending public services in Canada. We know that robust, well-funded public services serve Canadians best, and that the privatization of these services leads to higher costs, as auditors general have revealed when they gain access to the full range of information about a privatization project. Privatization, whether through asset sales, P3s, outsourcing, or social impact bonds, also represents a real threat to the quality and level of access that public services should provide. As such, CUPE has serious concerns about C-58, both about the parts of the current Access to Information Act that it proposes to amend and about the existing deficiencies it fails to correct. First, this bill leaves intact Sections 18 and 20, which exempt from disclosure any material or information that falls under the broadly undefined category of trade secrets, both of the government or of a third party. The language removes from public scrutiny any financial, commercial, scientific, or technical information that has what is called substantial value or is reasonably likely to have substantial value in an undetermined future. The current language allows the government to refuse to disclose third-party information that was treated confidentially by that third party. It exempts from disclosure, in a preposterously broad limitation, any information that, quote, could reasonably be expected to be materially injurious to the ability of the Government of Canada to manage the economy of Canada. The scope of information that can be exempted from public disclosure under this language is virtually infinite. Contracts with private security or accounting companies, pharmacological research, reports by consultants on proposed government actions, records of foreign investment, information relating to the health and safety performance of a third-party entity providing public services. These are some of the possible exemptions under Sections 18 and 20, and they are also examples of material and information that must be accessible to Canadians if access to information legislation is to be meaningful. Certainly, we understand that there are legitimate grounds for non-disclosure. such as national security and personal privacy, and that access requests can sometimes require judgment calls by government officials. However, these exemptions, like those in other sections that hide from view the actions and decisions of the PMO, Cabinet, and Ministers' offices, are overly broad, not subject to a test of real harm, and are not subordinated to a meaningful public interest override. We must note as well the dangerous way these exemptions intersect with other legislation this government has proposed, in what others more cynical than us might characterize as a war on transparency. For example, Bill C-22 gives the staff of the Department of Defense the authority to decide what is excluded from disclosure without any independent review. In Bill C-44, Section 28 of the Canada Infrastructure Bank Act expands exclusions to include information about proponents, private sector investors, and institutional investors in infrastructure projects, again, with no independent review. The Canada Infrastructure Bank provides a clear example, in fact, of the regressive nature of the current legislative trajectory. Not only does the Canada Infrastructure Bank Act lay out overly broad additional exemptions, it also places final decisions before Cabinet, essentially shrouding the entire process in darkness, out of the reach of the Information Commissioner, the Auditor General, and even the federal courts. Let us provide a concrete example. CUPE recently filed an access to information request for information and material related to the government's participation in the private REM light rail project in Montreal. Specifically, the reports and analyses prepared by a third-party consultancy called Blair Franklin Capital Partners. This is a project to which the government has committed $1.3 billion public dollars, and it is something the government has indicated the Canada Infrastructure Bank may take on as one of its first projects. So is this a good investment? What information has the government relied on to make that decision? Were environmental, health and safety, or accessibility concerns integrated into the decision? Was it the business? What is the business model and the business case? What is the projected fee structure? And will it be regressive or restrict access? Answers to these questions are central to the public's understanding of this particular public investment. In other words, the public interest is immense. However, when we received a response, after a delay, of course, Infrastructure Canada invoked Section 18 to redact virtually all of the records, making the entire 613-page disclosure incomprehensible and useless. Rather than apply the exemptions narrowly and with respect to the public interest, it has become common practice for the government to redact by default, to exclude by default. This is an application that runs counter to the stated aims of the Act and the bill under review, and counter to international standards of open government. While there may be legitimate exemptions for disclosure of third-party information, they would need to pass the test of real harm in each case. It is not legitimate for government to refuse disclosure simply because the information is related to a third-party interest. A recent report by the Vancouver-based Columbia Institute, titled The Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Public's Right to Know, notes that there is virtual unanimity among information commissioners across Canada that private entities who receive public funds or perform a public service or public interest function must be covered by access to information legislation. This is the emerging consensus internationally as well. Here, though, this government has moved in the opposite direction by establishing a regime in which information on how our public services and public infrastructure are provided, how they are funded, how these decisions are made, and even who is involved in the work can be hidden behind a curtain of third-party privilege. CUPE submits that instead the government needs to ensure that access to information under Sections 18 and 20 faces far narrower exemptions that are subject to a test of actual harm, to a strong public interest override, to review by the Information Commissioner, and that this Act take precedence over any other Act, such as the Canada Infrastructure Bank Act, that seeks to unreasonably limit the public's right to know. We would also like to take a moment to echo the serious concerns of your previous witnesses. Section 6, as written, creates new hurdles to gaining access by establishing requirements for the structure and content of requests that voids the government's duty to assist and defeats the very purpose of the Act. Section 6 also would allow the government of the day to create unilaterally a do-not-respond list of troublesome Canadians who always seem to want to know something and ask too many big questions. The determination that an access request is frivolous, trivial, vexatious, or made in bad faith is one that cannot and should not be made by the government of the day to whom the information request is made. This is a subjective determination that is necessarily rife with conflict of interest. Another barrier to access is cost, and C-58 leaves open the possibility of government requiring new and onerous costs for access. Where is the promise for a nominal $5 fee with all other costs voided, and the $5 fee itself refunded if timelines are not met? We also agree with other witnesses that C-58 represents a missed opportunity. There are serious problems with the current legislation, problems which the current government correctly identified while in opposition, that remain wholly unaddressed in the proposals before you. Canada, despite its leadership in other areas, sets a very poor example globally with the current Act. According to the Right to Information Index, compiled in part by the Centre for Law and Democracy and based on 61 indicators, Canada is ranked 49th out of 111 countries in the quality of its access to information laws. News Media Canada has criticized this government's approach to access to information as being even worse than the previous government's. And your own outgoing Information Commissioner has called Bill C-58 a regression of existing rights, as has been mentioned many times in this committee. We urge you to take her 28 carefully considered recommendations. To summarize, we submit that the law must apply to private third parties that receive public funds or perform a public service function. All exemptions must be discretionary in practice. The Information Commissioner's Office must have at its disposal a full toolbox of real order-making powers and the authority to enact penalties. And we agree with Democracy Watch that the appointment process for the Information Commissioner must be changed so that it is open, merit-based, and not controlled by the very ministers the Commissioner will be reviewing. In conclusion, we cannot recommend that Bill C-58 proceed as written. It is quite simply bad legislation. It makes access more difficult rather than improving it. Instead, CUPE calls on the government to review the problems these hearings and previous commentary have identified, research the best examples from your provincial and international counterparts, and draft amendments that have as their guiding principle what Mr. MacArthur, the acting commissioner from BC, called access by design, an act that facilitates access rather than blocks it, that leads to a government that is truly open by default and closed only in the narrowest, independently defensible circumstances. Thank you again for the time, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll start off 7-minute round to MP Fortier.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here this afternoon and for attending today, presenting your testimony. It's very valuable for our discussion here as a committee we're looking at this legislation. Monsieur Bienvenu, if I could ask you a question, but I'll introduce my context first. I, like you, am always cognizant of judicial independence and the role that the separation of governance from the judiciary plays in ensuring our democracy stays strong and the rule of law is maintained. I'm also very aware of the need for transparency. And the testimony that we have heard numerous times here at this committee is that there is a need for progress, and this legislation is long overdue, as you probably know already. You've mentioned that you believe that enforcement of these rules should rest with the Chief Justices versus the independent commissioner. Can you elaborate on why you think that this power should rest with Chief Justices?
Thank you, Madam Fortier, for this question. My submission concerning decisions to be made, decisions that the bill would have made by the commissioner or the registrar, and that I have suggested should be made by the Chief Justice of the court concerned, is the decision as to whether the contemplated publication of a given judicial expense could undermine judicial independence or not. That is the decision that currently the bill would place under the responsibility of the registrar or the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs. And we say that it is unacceptable from a constitutional point of view to place the decision of whether a fundamental constitutional principle, such as judicial independence, is undermined or not, and to ask a member of the executive to make a final determination of that question. Under our form of government, that kind of decision rests with the judiciary. Under the bill that is before you, sections 90.20 and 42, I've mentioned the two in my opening remarks, would place that decision with the registrar and the commissioner we say that in the first instance, the decision should be with the Chief Justice of the court concerned.
Another question I was wondering if you could take the time to answer is, does this not lead to inconsistent application of the law where each Chief Justice has more discretion versus an independent commissioner who is applying the policies across courts? And just as importantly, do you not think that this has the potential to create tensions within the courts when a Chief Justice is forced to decide between a colleague and access to documents and disclosures that they may not want to be in the public domain? That's my question. I have another one after.
Well, the short answer to your question is no. I don't think that there is a risk that that be the case. But I need to insist that you are focusing on an exception. The thrust of my submission is that the regime itself is inadequate and unnecessary. There are two aspects to this bill. One is accountability, and the other one is transparency. Accountability in the case of judicial expenses is currently assured by the fact that these expenses are not in the main discretionary. A judge will incur travel expenses if his or her Chief Justice asks of him or her to travel. In addition, the traveling and the accommodation expenses incurred on that occasion need to be submitted to the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs. The Commissioner publishes guidelines that set limits on rates that may be incurred in hotels, per diem allowances.
But with the, I know I understand the expenses, and I understand, but don't you think that we're trying to also show that as much as governance and the judicial should also have the same as the members of parliament, ministers, or we should all know, Canadians should know what is happening in the courts?
That is a very important question. Why are judges in a position that is not comparable to that of elected officials or members of the bureaucracy? They are in a different position, I would submit, for at least 3 reasons. The first I've just mentioned. Their expenses are not in the main discretionary. The second is that they are currently subject to third-party verification. I have to insist on this. Every single judicial expense has to be submitted to an official whose very existence is
I have only 30 seconds left. What would be the third one?
I just need to finish my answer. Whose very existence is to stand as a buffer between the government and the judiciary. And the third reason, a very important reason, why judges are not in a situation comparable to elected officials is that judges may not publicly defend themselves when they are attacked. Judges speak through their judgments, and when they are attacked, they stand silent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, visitor, MP Clement. Thanks for coming.
I'm a stranger to these issues. I've never encountered these issues before. That's being facetious, Chair. Sorry about that. As a former president of the Treasury Board, I know a little bit about these issues. Mr. Bienvenu, to start with, can you just tell me what percentage of the claims under the current process are rejected or scaled back?
I do not have that information, but I know that there are expense claims that are rejected by the Commissioner.
Okay, so that's probably a better answer than saying all of them are 100% perfect. But it still begs the question that the taxpayers are in the dark about whether there's a serial judicial officer whose claims are being rejected or what have you. So I guess the question. I guess the question that comes about then is, you keep talking about judicial independence, which is, of course, a hallowed principle in our country. But I'm still trying to connect the dots between how, if you have greater public accountability, prove to me or show me how that infringes on the independence of the judge. The judge still gets the paycheck from the Government of Canada, and yet no one says that that is an outrageous denial of judicial independence. So how is it that the judge can be paid by the Government of Canada, and ergo the taxpayers of Canada, and yet the expenses are still in this alternative universe of process? So walk me through
sir,
it.
I have to say, with respect, that I disagree with your premise. It is not the case that the Canadian public is in the dark as to judicial expenses. I have mentioned in my opening remarks that all reimbursable expenses must fall within one of the, I believe, 5 allowances that are set out in the Judges Act. And it is explained in the Judges Act what expenses are reimbursable. In addition to those broad categories, I've mentioned the role of the Commissioner. And to go into further detail, the Commissioner issues guidelines that are available to judges detailing the rules that he applies, currently it is a he, to the reimbursable expenses under the Judges Act. So the percentage that you have asked for, the percentage of claims that are rejected, would not be a useful piece of information, because if the Commissioner does his job well through the publication of guidelines and is clear as to what conditions a claim must comply with in order to be accepted, then judges need to comply with these guidelines and their expense.
Yeah, okay, but how is it that judicial independence is degraded if we have
sir,
more general or more specific transparency?
The fact, and that's an important point for members of the committee, the fact that judicial independence is engaged by the publication regime set out in that bill is acknowledged by the bill itself. The bill itself contains an exception if the publication can undermine judicial independence. So the fact that judicial independence is engaged is acknowledged in the bill.
But you're saying it all offends.
Well, let me answer your question. You're asking me, well, give me examples how judicial independence is engaged by the requirement to publish expenses. And the example I'll give you is traveling expenses.
Sorry, say that again.
The example I was going to give you is traveling expenses.
Yeah.
Judicial independence has 3 core characteristics: security of tenure, financial security, administrative independence. Administrative independence has been held to extend to assignment decisions by Chief Justices. I am convinced that if this publication requirement remains in the bill, assignment decisions by Chief Justices will be influenced by the risk that one judge or more than one judge of our national courts will stand out by reason of his or her traveling expenses. And I think that would compromise judicial independence. The second way
Okay,
in
and
which
I've only got a minute
independence-
left, Pierre, so you're going to have to wrap it, because I have one more question for Mr. Ramsey. Maybe I'll cut you off there. It's nothing to do with what you're saying. It's just I only have a limited amount of time. Mr. Ramsey, can you just, based on your critique of the situation, what's the motive involved here? Why is the government doing what you're saying that they're doing in terms of degrading transparency and openness?
I don't really have any interest in the motive or any speculation on what the motive might be. I can only talk about what the effect of the application of exclusions. And what we see and have seen over many years is an application of what should be narrowly defined and specific exclusions that are applied very broadly to specifically exclude from disclosure anything relevant in any way to the interests of a third party or private party engaged in some sort of public interest function with the government. When in our view, that language should be used should be subject to a test of real harm. And as I was mentioning with our specific case, the 613 pages of blacked out pages, we believe, and that's not the only case, we have multiple examples of that. We believe that there are real public interest, there's information in the public interest contained in that information that is being excluded, but not being subjected to a test of real harm and not being subject to the public interest override. And there have been many people before you in this committee talking about the issue of the lack of a strong public interest override in this act, and we agree with that.
That's time. I'd like to welcome another guest to our committee, MP Rankin, 7 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. I appreciate it, and welcome to our witnesses. I'd like to pursue with Mr. Bienvenu the line of inquiry that others have pursued. If the legislation contemplates that the registrar or the chief administrator or the commissioner can determine that the publication in a particular case might interfere with judicial independence, that of course connotes that in other cases it wouldn't. And in the interest of transparency, why wouldn't it be acceptable to allow them to exercise their discretion, subject to judicial review, if required? Why is that such a big deal? Secondly, what about the way in which the expense reports the rejected claims in the example that you gave? If it's the administrator or the commissioner actually, if he consistently accepts bogus claims or others, why shouldn't he bear the kind of accountability this legislation is designed to promote?
In response to your first question, the work of judges involves emotionally fraught issues of criminal conviction and sentencing, custody of children, dispute over wills, estates, bankruptcy matters, to give a few examples. That is why, as I stated in my opening remarks, the judicial function, judges adjudicate disputes. By definition, at the end of the process, one party is dissatisfied. And I think that there is a very real risk of mischievous use of information if it is tied to named individual judges. And I believe, and I'm here completing my answer to Madame Fortier, I had time to talk about the accountability objective of the Act, but the transparency objective of the Act, I believe, can be attained by the disclosure of expense information on a per expense category and per court basis. Where the problem lies is in tying individual judges to individual expenses in a publication regime where really you have too much and at the same time too little information. Too much because you have expenses tied to individual judges, but too little because the public will be unaware of the reasons why a given judge has incurred more expenses than the average or his colleague of the same court. So fundamentally, this regime, I would submit to you, is misconceived as it applies to judges, because I have given at least 3 reasons why I believe judges stand in a different position.
So if it wasn't individual decisions of expense claims for individual judges, but the aggregate expense performance, if I can call it that, by a particular court, and the commissioner was perhaps being too generous with expense claims, has a particular bent for expenses that is totally different than other superior courts, does the public have a right to know if the commissioner is acting inappropriately? Do they have the right to see, does the public have the right to see aggregate information that a particular that the commissioner provides?
I've acknowledged in my opening remarks that one way of pursuing the transparency objective of the Act is to get unattributed expense information made public by the commissioner. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Ramsey, I think you indicated that the law of Bill C-58 was unacceptable, and you indicated that, I can tell you you're in very good company. The Center for Law and Democracy, the Canadian Association of Research Librarians, media organizations, academic experts, and most notably the Information Commissioner of Canada, Madame Legault, whose report is certainly the most scathing I've ever read in my 30 years of looking at this legislation. You're in good company for saying that. What is your particular, if you had to list your most significant concerns, is it, you mentioned in answer to another question, you wanted a harms-based test for the exemptions under the Act? Would the failure to address that be the main problem with C-58? Could you tell us, in your judgment, what are the most significant problems with this bill?
From CUPE's perspective, I believe that the one of the most major deficiencies with Bill C-58 is what is not in C-58. There are a number of issues in the current access to information legislation that are inadequate. Members from all parties have acknowledged this over the years. There have been multiple studies, there have been multiple recommendations, and Canada's international counterparts have sped ahead, while Canada's Act has stayed the same for a very long time. And there are many political reasons for that, but I think that this represents an opportunity to address those issues, and they're not in Bill C-58. One of them that we are most concerned about, because this is central to our work, is access to information around the provision of public services, whether those public services are provided by government or in cooperation with a private entity. And currently, under the legislation, the trade secrets, in quotes, and commercial and economic information that belongs to a third party can be excluded under that blanket language.
So to the extent that a public-private partnership is involved, that would be a way for the government to avoid any kind of accountability, is your concern, because it would be seen much of that as trade secrets or sensitive business information which could not be disclosed under the Act.
I'll say this. It is a way currently for information to be excluded from access requests, and that is our concern, that information in the interest of Canadians, related to how their public services are delivered, how much they cost them, access to them in relation to fees, et cetera, that information be available to the Canadian public.
Thank you.
Thank you, MP Rankin. Last question of the day, MP Bayless, 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bienvenu. I'll follow up, put you back in the hot seat then. I'd like to understand a bit more about some of the arguments that you're making for judicial independence and some of the dangers, as you put forth, of linking a specific expenses to specific judges. If I understand correctly, we could have a situation where a judge, for whatever reason, has made judgments against somebody that they're not happy about, and they want to attack that judge. they might go through an access to information and find out that he's got these huge amount of travel expenses and compare it to other judges who have very little, and use this to maybe cast aspersions against his character, say he's wasting money, any type of thing like that.
Well, here he wouldn't have to ask for the information because it's a proactive publication
So it would be
system.
just out there. He could,
so the publication would be...
And how would that be used for mischief?
It could be, I mean, you know, I leave it to your imagination. I think...
to embarrass the judge, maybe? To
try to embarrass the judge. Again, the problem, as I've said earlier, is too little and too much. Too much and too little.
It's too granular in one sense?
It's too granular because it allows to tie expense levels with individual judges.
Without the
Some
understanding
judges happen to sit on national courts. National courts are very important.
So without
to
the
our
understanding
country.
of why this judge would have an awful lot, you can't compare
Exactly.
apples
The judge
to
may
oranges.
have had a 3-month trial in one of the most expensive cities in the country, and that will be reflected in his expense.
So I guess another question is, what value, if the value is to, and you've made suggestions that we're covering, on one sense, we have the control mechanisms in there. What would be the value, additional value? Do you see any additional value of going through this, adding this process to putting these expenses out for the general public?
I see no value and only serious downside in the regime as conceived in this bill. However, I've acknowledged in answer to Mr. Rankin's last question that I absolutely support and acknowledge the transparency objective of this bill and say that it can be achieved by disclosing information on a per expense category basis and per court basis. And it'll be easy to translate that on a per judge basis.
On an average per judge, you mean?
Excuse me, on an average per judge basis, exactly. But it'll be average, but per court, per expense, so it's pretty granular. But at least it will not single out individual judges, and it will, I think the reason for the level of expense will flow from the nature of the expense.
So in essence, you're for giving the information out in a manner that it can be used and to be effective and show transparency. But if I understand correctly, making sure not to target any one particular judge because of the very nature of the work that they do, they should not be individually targeted.
Precisely, sir. Precisely. The problem here is to tie the individual expenses to named judges.
You'd mentioned that it might impact their safety. Theoretically, how would that happen?
Well, judges tend to stay in the same hotel. Judges have, like anybody, have patterns of behavior, and judges usually do not identify themselves as judges when they travel for the security reasons that you can imagine. So that is a concern.
So in the worst case,
it is a concern if 50 judges gather for a legal education conference, and it's an annual conference, and it is published on the internet where on those dates these judges gather. It is just, in my submission, ill-advised to require that kind of granular information. There is a security risk to that kind of information being published.
You had also touched on administrative independence, a concern that this publication might impact administrative independence. Can you explain that?
Yes. Administrative independence has been held to extend to assignment decision by Chief Justices. Members of the committee, Chief Justices of Canada's national courts are troubled and extremely concerned by this regime. I cannot overemphasize this point. And these Chief Justices will not allow one of their justices to stand out.
So the problem is if they've got someone really good at something, but my God, he's run
They're
a
not going to
big
make the
thing,
best
I can't-
assignment decision in that case.
Because they
in
have to
order-
take into account this extra bit of
That's right.
They have to balance now, I've also got to put this information out there,
That's
so
right.
I'm not picking the best person for the best job. I've got to take into account something that has,
That's right.
in your estimation, no additional value. So they
That's
may not
right.
assign someone
and
that...
that's the decision between expense decisions that are discretionary and expense decisions that result from someone else's decision.
You say the
In
chief,
this case, the Chief Justice.
and you say they're very concerned about this particular point?
They're very concerned about this particular point.
They
They're
reflect-
very concerned about traveling expenses of named individual judges standing out without the information that would provide
to why?
context.
Did they reflect that publicly, or is that something they reflected to you? I don't know, I'm just asking.
This was expressed to me in
Again, by the nature of their work, they can't. They're somewhat limited in expressing what they think, and that. So, are you the porte-parole per se, or?
I'm the porte-parole of the association, and the as I've said, the Canadian Judicial Council has read the text of my submission and has said that it endorses the submission.
Thank you.
I have 2 minutes for Mr. Erskine Smith, if he'd like it. He's next on the list.
I wanted to get to 90.25, and the Canadian Judicial Council is exempted, and it's not clear to me if there's a concern about judicial independence for the Canadian Judicial Council, why that concern wouldn't apply to judiciary more broadly, and I'm inclined to strike that exemption when we get to clause by clause, and I wonder what you would say to that.
Well, it's unclear to me, too, sir, why there is that exemption, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. I mean, you've heard the substance of my position, which is that the whole regime should be changed. But insofar as that exemption is concerned, it's unclear where it's there, but it does result in anomalies. And let me give you one example. The very same judicial expense under this bill will need to be published or not, depending on whether the activity is a judicial council activity or not,
otherwise.
even though it's the same expense.
Two quick other questions. One in relation to 90.22. The Chief Justice of the affected court, if the wording read the registrar in consultation with the Chief Justice of the affected court, or the Chief Justice of the affected court should be making the final determination without consulting anyone else? And how would that work in practice?
The suggestion I've made is that the decision be that of the Chief Justice.
And the last thing I would say is, isn't the answer simply to your, I take the specific concern, frankly, is that this individualized expenses, and specifically in relation to travel, you keep coming back to. I understand at the federal court we're talking about, and the tax court or the traveling courts. Isn't the simple answer for the courts to simply say, this judge writes this number of decisions, sits on this many panels, and they publish that information alongside any expenses? And I don't see a reporter or any member of the Canadian public taking seriously any concerns if they see that the travel expenses and the large amount of travel expenses for an individual judge is commensurate with the work that individual judge is doing.
We're at time.
Sir, well, I'll answer very briefly. I've given a copy to the clerk of this committee of my submission. We have in our discussions focus on travel expenses, but our concern is not limited to travel. So I do invite members of the committee to read the written submission I've given, and you'll see other concerns and reasons given for these other concerns.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing today, and thank you to the members of committee. We're adjourned.
Good job, Chair.
There we go.
you.